Today, plenty of fudge around tariffs, markets, and the election campaign. Hello again, it's Martin, author from Digital Finance Analytics, Wealth Notice Post covering finance and property news. Well, markets have continued to react negatively, with the ASX 200 down another 2.38% on Friday, taking the year-to-date falls to 6.02%. And the local volatility index was also elevated. It was a similar story across Asia, apart from China and Hong Kong, which were both closed for a holiday, with the Japanese Nikkei down 2.8% and down 9% across the week, and down 15% to date, while the KOSPI was down 0.86%, perhaps impacted also by the news of the presidential impeachment. And overnight in the US, the S&P 500 was down 4.84%, the Dow was down 3.98%, and the NASDAQ was down 5.97%. It'll be interesting to see if that trend continues on Friday, and I will make my normal weekly show tomorrow. The VIX in the US remains elevated, and the dollar index fell again. Meanwhile, Trump seemed to suggest the tariffs were open to negotiation in his latest grab, although other officials were less open to changing them. And also we got some clarity, if that's the right word, on just how much fudge there is in the calculations they use to come up with the figures, which, as I said yesterday, were a bit suspect. Originally, commentators assumed more science behind them, including things like exchange rates and GST or VAT rates. But now, according to the BBC, when Trump presented a giant cardboard chart detailing the tariffs in the White House Rose Garden, it was initially assumed that the charges were based on a combination of existing tariffs and other trade barriers like regulations. But they said, if you unpick the formula, it boils down to simple maths. Take the trade deficit for the US in goods with a particular country, divide that by the total goods imported from that country, and then divide the number by 2. A trade deficit occurs when a country buys or imports more physical products from other countries than it sells or exports to them. So, for example, the US buys more goods from China than it sells to them. There is a goods deficit of $295 billion. The total amount of goods it buys from China is $440 billion. So you divide 295 by 440 and you get to 67%. And then you divide that by 2 and round it up. Therefore, the tariff imposed on China is 34%. Similarly, when it's applied to the EU, the White House formula results in a 20% tariff. Many commentators have pointed out that these tariffs are not reciprocal. Reciprocal would mean that they were based on what countries already charged the US in the form of existing tariffs, plus non-tariff barriers, things like regulations that drive up costs. But the White House official methodology document makes clear that they have not calculated this for all the countries on which they have imposed tariffs. Instead, the tariff rate was calculated on the basis that it would eliminate the US's goods trade deficit with each country. So Trump has broken away from the formula in imposing tariffs on countries that buy more goods from the US than they sell to it. For example, the UK does not currently run goods trade deficits with the UK, yet the UK has been hit with a 10% tariff, and in total, more than 100 countries are covered by the new tariff regime, and some smaller, less wealthy countries are actually the worst hit. And of course, it doesn't include the services sector at all. So there is plenty of fudge in these numbers, I think, to justify a political stance. And also, Albo said yesterday, this is not the action of a friend. And frankly, the fudge continues. If you have been following the Australian election campaigns, as both sides try to react, but without reacting, which takes us nicely to a show I recorded yesterday with Adam Stokes on his channel, where we discuss the tariffs, the end of globalization, and also the local political scene. So I'm going to play that now, and I'll be back with my normal weekend show tomorrow, where I will look at the damage done across the markets in more detail. But here is Adam introducing his show. Enjoy.
I've got a special guest tonight, our good friend Martin North, who is going to give us some clarity on what's happening, first of all, with the tariffs in the United States spreading across the world. And then we're going to relate that to what's happening in the election here in Australia coming up very quickly. And of course, figuring out who's actually in charge. Is it the media? Is it the government in power of the day? Is it greater influence from abroad? Who knows? Let's try and get some clarity as we bring Martin North, our friend, in. Martin, thanks for joining us tonight.
Hi there. Well, nice to get back. And I tell you what, this is a really interesting week. You know, I think the 2nd of April, 2025 will go down as a critical lynch point in the history of not just Australia, but actually the world, because there are some really important questions to ask about what's going on. And I do think it links very nicely to the current election campaign in Australia too, because, you know, there are issues that are not being spoken about through the campaign, which should be being spoken about. So maybe we'll just table some of those and bring some of the things together. As for whether I can bring heat or light, we will see. But I have to say that I've never been more confused than I am now with what's going on.
Well, I'm both relieved and concerned that you say that, because in my mind, things are just moving so quickly, I can barely keep up. I was sure that we were on a path to huge prosperity when Trump came in, bringing some economic security to the world, perhaps reducing wars, perhaps the tariffs were going to be a rough ride at first, but gripping up with DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, reducing a lot of government waste. But it seems to be happening in an opposite effect, where people are very scared. There's a lot of uncertainty. The tariffs are rolling out. Let's start off with the tariffs. So what we can see is I released a post today. So we know tariffs are rolling out across the world. And what was very interesting to me in a post that I released just today was that you can see what Trump's done here is that he's showing, you know, how much tariffs he's putting on other people, but equally he can see how much these other nations, the tariffs are putting on him. Now, I won't go through them all, but some that jump out. China puts a 67% tariff on the United States, and the reciprocal tariff is 34%. Vietnam is a 90% tariff on the United States, and a reciprocal tariff going the other way at 46%. So what I learned recently is that, of course, I understand tariffs, but what I didn't understand was how intense the tariffs were on the United States. But when I looked into the tariffs on the United States, something I've always considered when it comes to the power of America is that they get to print the global reserve currency. So on one hand, it's like, yeah, well, fair enough. You're matching tariffs, reciprocal tariffs, as he calls them. And those reciprocal tariffs aren't as high as an example, China at 67% and United States going back to China at 34%. But in the same token, you've got America who prints a global reserve currency. So as you know, we've been talking a lot about Bitcoin on this channel. We've been talking about a hard, sound, immutable, open, borderless censorship money. And part of that is that no one can print it without limit. But when it comes to the United States, they can print their currency without limit. And you can see on the US debt clock, they're up to nearly $37 trillion in debt. It's a long introduction and rant, I realise, to say, are these tariffs fair? Are they overdue? Or has Trump gone too far?
Well, first thing to say is that that card there is full of fuzzy numbers. It is not comparing apples with pears. So if you look at what they've done, they've actually taken things like VAT or GST, and where GST or VAT is charged, they've included those. Now, you'd argue that that's a bit of a weird one, because, of course, if you think about Australia, it isn't just people from overseas who get charged that. If you actually sell anything in Australia, you're a company, you charge GST. So it's really important to understand that those numbers are fudged. They are not telling the complete story. Now, it is true that some different countries, through various means, and that could be, for example, through government subsidies, through the industrial system that they've got, for example, they're included in those numbers. So, government assistance, exchange rate equalization. In other words, if you're manipulating a currency, that's actually included in that calculation too. So what they've done is they've put this wrapper around tariffs, which is a much bigger set of issues than it might first appear. It isn't just at the border you get charged X, right? It is a much broader issue. So that's the first point. The second point is, it is interesting that the richest country in the world is claiming poor. And the basis of it is that they've been hollowed out, particularly the middle class has been hollowed out. Why have they been hollowed out? because over the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, the doctrine of globalization was do it cheap, find a country where you can do it cheap because labor's cheap, because the environmental standards are lower, because you can essentially get away with murder, and energy costs are also lower as well. So it is, if you go back in history and you think about a local community looking down the road, and they've got a blacksmith in one community, they've got a blacksmith in another community. Both are working on their own little business. They probably don't get any economy of scale. Sometimes they're busy, sometimes they're not. And then suddenly the blacksmith goes down the road and says, "Oh, I know what I'll do is I'll start making horse stuff for you too. So don't worry, I'll make all of the horseshoes. You just fit them, right?" And suddenly what you've done then is shifted the balance of power between those two, because effectively that other blacksmith, because they've got a bigger business, can effectively become more efficient, etc., etc. And that is the essence at the heart of this. Why globalization happened was it became cheaper to manufacture stuff over there and then bring it in rather than do it locally. Why? Low wages, low environmental standards, and also potentially government support and all of those things too. So that was what was happening. And we ended up with a globalized view of the world, which says the cheapest source is the best source. And everybody benefited. I mean, think of a mobile phone. The mobile phone is effectively a symbol of globalization, to my mind, right? But the trouble is that as a result of that, it became harder and harder for firms to compete. So in the US, the Rust Belts, they used to have a motor manufacturing capability that was world class, world beating. Think of Ford. Well, that pretty much has been decimated. If you think of Australia as well, the globalization, the creation of offshore manufacturing has hollowed out manufacturing in Australia. So, our economic base in Australia is more limited than it's ever been. If you look at it, we are, way down the list from where we used to be. So at the heart of what Trump is talking about, there is a grain of truth. And that is that the world order that was ushered in partly through these, the globalists from the United Nations and the World Economic Forum and all of those guys was saying, we should be one entity. We had also, of course, extended supply chains, and you saw how well those extended supply chains worked through COVID. They didn't work. We are reliant on the international transportation systems, and when the airlines, have a problem like at Heathrow, when the Heathrow stopped for 24 hours, that created a mayhem. Or when we had the Panama Canal. So these extended supply chains, and then the other philosophy that was in here was what's called just in time. So the idea is you don't hold inventory locally. What you do is you actually rely on fast supply chains to be able to bring something in when you need it. All of those things have created a global structure that benefits some rather than others. It benefits large corporations. But take an example, Apple, for example. If you look at its tech, most of it's being built in Vietnam at the moment. So that's an interesting observation. If you think about Nike, shoes are being built not in the US, but somewhere else. So it's created a world order of globalization, but it's also a race at the bottom in terms of price, environmental standards, long hours, all those things. So it's not been universally good. So that's the background. So anyway, Trump rocks up with this here chart, which says, look, hey, they're doing us a disservice. Now, this is an excuse to be able to basically levy tariffs. And what they're doing is saying, well, we're going to bring in the 10% tariff everywhere first, and then a few days later, we're going to actually start creating reciprocal tariffs. And that's when the reciprocity is about this issue of all of the things that Trump and his team were worrying about, which includes, as I mentioned, things like the exchange rate, the fact that maybe exchange rates have been manipulated, the fact that some of the costs that are actually coming are being borne by governments directly rather than actually by the manufacturers. So all of those things. So that's the context. But it, to my mind, marks the end of globalization. So whatever we're going to move to now, this is an earthquake. This is a major structural change, which is why then the financial markets are very nervous. Look at the US markets; they're actually down further. Markets in Asia are also down as well, even Australia down, because the uncertainty level has gone through the roof. And the final point, just to say on this, Adam, this isn't the end of the problem. This is the start of the problem, because now they're going to actually negotiate on a sort of case by case basis. And, the bottom line is you have to tip your forelock to King Trump and say, yes, sir, please, sir, can we have some more, sir? So there is actually a thing about, the power of the US. And the final point to say, remember that he's only thinking about benefiting the US, or more precisely, benefiting certain people within the US, because what he's trying to do is to create a revenue flow that will allow him then to cut taxes. And guess, I wonder who might actually benefit from tax cuts. Well, I don't think it will be equally spread across the US. I don't think that the working class or the middle class will necessarily benefit as much as some of those more affluent groups. But the problem is, of course, the tariffs will lift prices, which will lift inflation and put more pressure on the US economy. So it might well be ending up shooting themselves in the foot as well. So that's, in a nutshell, what I see going on.
We can see that tariffs has gone out everywhere across the world. And Australia we got 10%. And it was allegedly, interesting what you said, that there's a lot weaved into those numbers that is brought up on the chart. The reciprocal tariffs with Australia are essentially 10%. Now, there's been talk about the beef industry. God, they're so deep. There's so much to go through. And what really jumped out, what you said to me just then, is that, America's playing poor. And so I'm trying to not put any left versus right into this. I'm not trying to put, Trump bad and Biden good. I don't want to go into any of that space. I want to really stick into the economics of what is happening around us. So, as you mentioned, the numbers that he's brought up actually capture a lot more than simply a black and white tariff. There's a lot of other numbers that are woven into there. What I've mentioned is that you've got America that prints a global reserve currency, which can print fake money out of thin air to buy goods and services from other countries, putting real value for fake money. Now, admittedly, all first world nations pretty much all nations are printing fake money out of thin air, and the money printer continues to go brr. But at the same time, we've got the Australian election coming up, and it appears that, I could be wrong, but it appears that it's very difficult whilst you're running an election in Australia to figure out, right, what are we focusing on here? Are we focusing on our own economy, or are we focused more on the US economy? But of course, at the same time, I'm seeing that you've got these two front runners in politics in Australia saying, right, we've got to try and get into politics, but whoever wins then has to deal with Trump. So if we stand up too hard against Trump right now, and then I win, sure, I win and get the seat into the Australian Prime Minister seat. But then I've got to immediately get on an aircraft and fly over to the United States and make a deal with someone I may have been bad-mouthing in the campaign. So do you think the candidates for the Australian election are sort of biting their tongue at the moment, just in case, ironically, just in case they do win and then have to deal with someone that they've just been criticizing?
Well, I actually think it's actually very interesting. So Starmer in the UK went over to the US and bowed in front of Trump and offered him a royal visit, right?
That
and
was
guess
so
what?
awkward.
The UK got a 10% as well, right? So I don't think that spending a lot of time touching forelock makes a lot of sense. It's interesting that Canada, of course, has come out, arms out, as they would say in their game, arms up, to basically say no, we're going to respond. The Eurozone has also said that they're likely to respond. The issue is, does it make much difference if you do or if you don't respond? If you try and actually say yes, we'll change our digital tax, or we'll do this to it. The original hypothesis that people went into with this, that these tariffs were more about negotiation than they were about actually fundamentally shifting the game, right? I think that Trump, and if you read the announcement that came, he quoted a whole bunch of first-term outcomes that said, There was little inflation as a result of the first round of tariffs when I was within the first time. We actually managed to establish considerable manufacturing capability in the US on the back of it. So actually, he's arguing there is a bunch of reasons why you do this. So this isn't just posturing, which basically means that it almost doesn't matter what individual countries do with regard to their positioning. The other interesting observation, just going back to China, China would say, well, one of the reasons why there's a massive trade disparity between, what's going one way versus the other is that there are so many things that China is restricted from getting access to because of what the US has done. For example, some of the high-tech stuff that China would love to get hold of, they can't get hold of because the US says, no, China can't have that, right? So there's a lot going on below the surface. I don't think that what you do with regard to Trump should actually be a significant debate in the current election. But what I do think we need to think about is not the first order impacts in Australia. So about 5% of exports go to the US. So it's significant, but not dramatic. Oh, steel, by the way, is at 25%. So, that's a more significant thing. But it's a second order effects. What happens if other Asian countries really go off the boil? What happens if demand for our products and services, and of course we dig up all of some stuff out the ground and ship it overseas and add very little value, and what happens if that goes? So that's it's the economic fallout, it's the consequence, it's the second order effects. And in fact, the RBA came out and made the point that the impact could be quite significant, the second order impacts. And I think we should be thinking more about those second order impacts. And I don't know whoops, wrong one. Let me just go there. Whether you can see this. Let's go there. Yeah, there we go. This is actually, it's back to front. Is it the right way around at your end? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I can see that. It looks good.
Okay, so this is actually just an interesting chart that shows you the reciprocal tariffs, where it would be. And it's worth going back and looking. This is higher than it's been, for 100 years plus, right? And I'd also make the point that in the 1930s, you can see that the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act lifted tariffs. Now, that was part of a rather bad economic outcome. And I have a nasty suspicion that what we're actually doing is laying the foundations here for a recession, not just in the US, but potentially more globally. So I'm more worried, and I think we should be more worried if we're talking about the situation in the elections, about the economic consequences of this, rather than how you're dealing with Trump. Of course, Dutton will say, well, you should have been there earlier, et cetera, but I'm not sure it would have made a lot of difference, right? But it's the economic consequences that we should be thinking about. We are not in a strong position in Australia because of our very narrow manufacturing base, because of the fact that our growth rates are pretty low. Now, people are saying, well, maybe if we get a recession or if the US goes into recession, that's more likely to cut interest rates. Well, maybe. But I don't think necessarily that the debate around tariffs that we will be getting through the election is the one we should be getting.
It makes me wonder, when we talk about these tariffs rolling out at the moment, so we've got a chart up here, and you can see that like Cambodia was getting a reciprocal tariff of 49%, Vietnam 46%, Sri Lanka 44%, and Bangladesh 37%. What really this whole thing has made me wonder is perhaps what Trump is doing is actually making a lot of these countries, including ourselves, stand on our own feet. Perhaps it's driving manufacturing and industry back to us. So let's go back to the pandemic as an example. So during the pandemic, we discovered in Australia that there was a lot that we couldn't produce. In fact, the world discovered there was a lot we couldn't produce. Just as you just said at the beginning of the video, you were talking about the whole world was outsourcing all of their manufacturing, primarily America, but many countries followed suit. They just outsourced it to the cheapest bidder. Equally, they outsourced, in my opinion, they outsourced their carbon footprint. So as an example, in Australia, we say we're all about the environment. So we're not going to burn our coal and we're not going to burn our gas because look at us, we're not putting a carbon footprint down. But the hypocrisy of that is that, of course, we then just export all of this stuff and we get other people to burn our energy, our fossil fuels. And we think we're so good. They're going, yeah, look at us, we're reducing our carbon footprint. Meanwhile, we're all starving and cold and have no energy to produce stuff because it costs too much. So we outsource it. And then equally, all of that energy that we say that we're not burning in Australia because we have the moral high ground, we're simply exporting our carbon footprint, and they're producing all of those carbon emissions. And then, of course, we buy back all of this stuff, digging up raw earth materials out of Australia, as an example, sending it overseas, and then they refine it and package it, whatever they do with it, and then we buy it back with huge shipping costs involved and huge impact on the environment when you have massive cargo ships pumping out huge diesel fumes into the environment. So I want to get your thoughts on it, even if what's happening at the moment seems very frustrating with Trump. I mean, Canada, you gave an example. What do they? I think they say elbows up or something like that.
Elbows up. That's right.
What does that mean? Elbows up? Just
it's a hockey, ice hockey term.
Oh, is that what's going on? Okay.
Yeah.
We can see that Canada, in many ways, has been forced to stand on its own feet and start producing itself, and maybe Australia is now forced to stand on its own feet. So, the analogy I'm perhaps trying to draw is that, when you've got a parent who's very strict with you and they're doing something that makes no sense at the time, but it actually makes you a better kid because you study harder or do better on the sporting team. Do you think there could be an unintended consequence from this, that in fact many economies around the world become stronger because they're now standing on their own feet?
Well, it's a very interesting point there, and it goes back to my analogy of the blacksmith and the local village, right? Can you run a business locally sufficiently well to be able to make it work, or do you need global scale and efficiency? Now, if you think about what's happened, we have had a significant growth in large corporations, and those large corporations are actually quasi countries in their own right. If you think about how much they generate in terms of revenue, and their footprint is actually not just in one country, in multiple countries. So the first point, and somebody asked in the chat, well, who's driving some of this agenda? Well, some of it, of course, is those corporations have been looking for this idea of the cheapest place, for example, to house themselves from a tax perspective. So Ireland has done extremely well because they have a very cheap tax regime for large corporates. And so Google, for example, and other players, are actually somewhat based in Ireland. Now, is that good for the rest of the world? Well, maybe not, but maybe it's good for Ireland. That Ireland has had a huge income boost from its position as effectively a tax haven. Now, is that good? Is it not? Well, I suppose it depends on where you look. But it seems to me that there is. It goes back to my grain of truth point. If you actually have a capacity locally that you can invest in and can successfully develop, it makes sense to do it. In Australia, it's almost impossible, though. Why? Because our energy prices are significantly higher, way higher than they should be, and way higher than manufacturing, for example, in China or elsewhere. Why? Because of our different energy policy. And as you said, we've outsourced all of the emissions and everything else to China. And China is still building power stations with coal, as well as actually doing the renewable stuff as well. So there is an interesting question there. The other point, of course, is just thinking about the way supply chains work. And it is quite complicated. If you think about building a car, for example, a car has many thousands of components. Many of those components are not built in the same country as the car is built. So actually what happens is, if you trace the component flows for manufacturing a car, even if you assemble the final vehicle in, let's say, the US, quite often what you find is it's got components from Mexico and components from Canada, and it's got components, and it's gone backwards and forwards a few times. So actually, the tariffs are not just a one clip of the ticket, but it's actually a clip of the ticket along the way, and so you end up with this massive sort of cost on cost on cost on cost and cost. So if you want to build it locally, can you build it competitively locally? And of course, we've been fortunate or unfortunate, depending on how you look at it, to pay, $2 for a t-shirt. Well, if you wanted to actually have a t-shirt made in Australia, I reckon it wouldn't be $2. I reckon it would be $20 or $40. Now, the question is, are we as consumers willing and able to pay that? Because that's the other side of all this, what are consumers going to do? Are they going to actually go and buy local? In Canada, they are actually advertising now, buy Canadian, whatever it costs, buy Canadian. And maybe that's a good thing. So maybe there is actually a good side to this, which is, well, we should be, and I argued for a long, long time, we should be actually building more capability to manufacture stuff in Australia. We shouldn't be just reliant on the property market, which is stupid, and the natural resources that we are gifted and can ship around the world. We should be building a more rich and more capable economy. But it's narrowed in the last little while. It's narrowed. So we've actually gone bad policy. So, there is a potential upside, but the downside here is recession. The downside here is that things are going to cost a lot more. The downside is that people's economic stability is being rocked dramatically. And so the question is it worth the candle? And, go back to Trump is only worried about the US. Trump is only worried about making the US great again, not about making Australia great again, right? So it's almost hang everybody else. I'm not interested in that. I'm just interested in my own agenda in the US to maximize the outcome for the US, or at least for parts of the US. And I'm a bit skeptical personally of whether, in fact, the broader US population will benefit. Some will, some won't, but a lot of people will actually, I think, be disadvantaged. So, this is a real big tricky, but as I say, this is an earthquake. This is a significant earthquake, an economic earthquake. And it cuts right in the face of all of these globalists, all of these people who said we need to get more and more global, we need to take away all the trade barriers. And by the way, interestingly, a lot of the trade agreements that have been put in place in recent years, to an extent, were negotiated, quite long, complicated negotiations, to wire in a lot of the disadvantage that was already in there. So it's fascinating when you actually stop and think about it. Well, maybe these global trade arrangements, who do they really benefit? Do they really benefit us? At the end of the day, I'm not sure they always did. So there's a big set of questions here below the waterline.
You make me think about when you said about the T-shirts that we can get them for $2 in Australia. Like I've seen that these shirts it's like some things I buy in Australia, and I'm like, I couldn't even post this box to myself.
Yes.
If it was empty, you buy something online and I buy it for $2, and I couldn't even send something to myself from overseas for $2, even if it was a piece of paper. Yet we've had this luxury of it, and this is one of the other things that I said. Perhaps this is a positive unintended consequence, that it would have a positive effect on the environment. For example, I was recently in the States, and I went over to this big, I can't say what I went for, but it was something important. And I took my suit, but I forgot my belt. You always forget something. I had all my nice shoes and my ties and my cufflinks, everything, but I forgot a belt. And I thought, oh, well, I'll just duck down to Walmart and I'll buy a belt. And when I went in there was these racks and racks of belts. And of course, none of them were made in America, but they were so cheap that instead of buying one belt, I bought 4 belts. And it was overconsumption, but I thought, well, it's so cheap, and maybe I'll wear this different belt with a different pair of shoes. But if they were more expensive, I would have bought probably just 1 belt instead of 4, and that would have reduced my consumption. When it goes to the T-shirt analogy that you gave us, that, if it is a $2 shirt, even if I don't really want it, I might buy it as a nighttime shirt. But if it's a $20 shirt, that's going to curve my behavior and therefore curve my impact on the environment. So again, maybe this is a positive effect, just as we saw with the pandemic. For all the horrific economic consequences, we could see that, this big heat stamp on the world just slowed down for a minute. I think I was looking at the canals in Venice on imagery that you could actually see the bottom of the canals, which this never seen before, because it's always being stirred up by gondoliers moving through there. But when you say Trump is really focused on the United States, I've been listening to other economists and commentators saying, well, without the support of all of these other nations, if you go to kinetic war as an example. So if you look at Afghanistan, Iraq 1, Iraq 2, America-led campaigns, but with a big coalition of forces backing up America and supporting them in many ways, whether it was giving legitimate firepower on the ground or just showing a political show of force and alliance to the enemy, the effect, I would suggest, is synergized. If many nations are now feeling betrayed by the United States, they feel like they've been forgotten or disrespected or insulted or bullied or belittled, or perhaps any of it. Could America, here's a philosophical question for you, could America be as strong as it is today if the whole world turned its back on it?
Well, it's an interesting question, but of course, the US has huge resources itself, and of course has been investing in local energy. So they're now a net exporter of oil and LNG. So in the short term, they would have issues because some of the capacity they need doesn't actually exist in the US. But what they want to do is build it. So they want to make it more resilient by building it within border, as it were. And so that's part of the strategy. That's part of what they want. And their argument is, well, we want to be, able to grow and develop the way we want, and hang everybody else. The difficulty is that what are the consequences for the rest of the world? And do they care? I'm not sure, really. It seems to me that Trump has turned his back on. Look, I made a show the other week called The End of Pax Americana. And it's worth just thinking about that, right? Because Pax Americana was effectively the philosophy that Western countries went with, that the US is the ultimate backstop. They've always got our back. If we have an issue, the military will get us out of it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And to that extent, Western economies built their whole way of thinking around the fact that the US would ultimately always be their Pax Americana. Now, I think Pax Americana is no longer right, and it's no longer there. And in fact, Albo, this in his press conference, said, this is not the action of a friend. When they actually put the tariffs on, is it a reliable? Are they reliable? And by the way, it's worth just reflecting on that in the context of AUKUS and the 300 and whatever it is billion that is going to deliver nuclear subs sometimes in the future, although the manufacturing timeline seems to have been slipping again. And interestingly, in the UK, there's been discussion about, literally in the last 24 hours, as to whether AUKUS makes any sense now, given the fact that the US is doing what the US is doing. So in all sorts of things, you sort of, this is unpicking a lot of the assumed way that the world worked. My point, though, is the bottom line is, I think the US is better positioned than almost any other country to be able to go it alone if it wants to. Nuclear power, of course, massive military, massive capacity to spend. The other interesting observation, that they hold gold. Well, that gold at the moment is being held at an artificially low price on their balance sheet. So one of the capacity options they've got is to revalue their gold. And if they did that, they blow the debt away. So that's another little observation. And by the way, there, of course, is an upcoming debate about the US debt and what they're going to do with it. So all of these things could be, laying a foundation for a future that may be okay for the US, but I question whether it's the right thing for the planet.
Well, of course, you and I are going to speak on your channel shortly, I guess, about crypto. And we often refer to the US debt clock, currently at $36 trillion, $677 trillion and climbing fast. And I can't help to think that as the world, this is no secret that we've been discussing for a long time, as the world searches for a hard money because they start to learn about money, I can't help to think that you've got so much competition now with initially, we were so happy using the US dollar as a global reserve currency. Then when the war kicked off in Ukraine and Russia, the whole world was woken up and was like, oh, well, maybe these, not tariffs, these sanctions on these countries where they can't spend their own money in a global financial system. And if we have our bank account seized, maybe we have to look for an alternative. So then BRICS was already starting before then, and then we had CBD starting before that. And then we've got Bitcoin in the background, and then we've got the EU upset with the United States, and we've got China and Russia, who has always been upset and want to be independent from this global financial system. So I can see this culmination point of all these different things happening when we look at tariffs, we look at the shift of the alliance. I'm glad you wrote AUKUS, because, is there really, would America have our backs? I hope they would, if something kicked off. But if you're going to slap tariffs on your best friends who's in surplus with the United States, and that was coming from Trump himself, he'd recognize that Australia buys more from America than vice versa. And yet we're still slapped with a tariff, and yet we're spending billions, long-term trillions of dollars in buying their equipment and forming these alliances. And now we wonder, well, of course, I wonder, I hope they would, but I don't know, I'm just a mere mortal. Would America have our back? And we can see in this image that we're looking at now from AUKUS, all three of those leaders, well, two of them have changed, and the third one being Albo, maybe his leadership will change. So deals that were made, Martin, over the last 12 months, all of these leaders could be replaced and steer this whole deal in a new direction. Likewise, when you put a lot of pressure on the world, you form new alliances. That is, your enemies form new alliances. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. So you can see this, in my opinion. Now, you're living in Europe, and I want your take on this. It appears that Europe seems to be in a very interesting position with the United States, because there seems to be a lot of friction, specifically between the United States and Europe. Probably park the UK aside. As you mentioned, there was an invite to come and meet the king, and that seemed to work quite well because there was a 10% tariff on the United Kingdom as opposed to what EU is facing. Look, what I'm trying to ask here is that, is there a total change in the global world order now? And it goes to the topic of tonight's video. Who's in charge? Like, is America in charge of the world? And if America is in charge of the world, was there a deeper state behind that when a leader rose up and said, right, I'm going to do it my way, I'm not going to fall to what you've been doing in the past, they tried to put a bullet in his head. If you go back a little bit further, he colluded with Russia. They tried to impeach him. They tried to put him in jail. They tried to make a lot of propaganda about him being evil and bad and orange and racist and Nazi. And then when that didn't work, they tried to put a bullet in his head. So it then makes me wonder, well, who's running the show? Is America trying to dominate the world, or is Trump really trying to just be independent? Or does the readings of Confessions of an Economic Hitman suggest that it doesn't actually matter who's at the helm? There's a deep state in the background, conspiracy theory or fact. Who's in charge, my friend?
Well, I have a view, and it won't be a popular view, that no one is in charge, right? There's either the cock-up theory of history or the conspiracy theory of history. And, there are a number of people who will put together quite coherent arguments as to why we've got a deep state cabal somewhere who are pulling the levers, and they're almost sitting around the table working what to do next, right? And that there is actually a plan. I'm afraid the bad news in my mind is no. What it is a lot of little pieces all rippling around the place. It's a bit like the butterfly effect. A butterfly flaps its wings and something happens over in the other side of the world. This is a highly complicated system with multiple things going on, multiple forces going on. And I don't personally think that there is anybody who's actually in control of unless you go religious on me, who's actually pulling the strings. There are people with particular views about how to actually drive things. And so you do get power blocks, so China and Russia are being forced together partly because of what the US has been doing. We got the BRICS arrangements there, of course, people looking for, an alignment there. But there are a couple of fundamental philosophical principles that drives in a particular direction. So if you have a neoliberal view of the world, which is to say, let the markets be the markets must always win. That takes you to the lowest cost of development wherever it's in the world. So the neoliberal worldview is a globalist view, right? And the fact of the matter is that, the neoliberal worldview has not done ordinary people very well at all. And that's the first point. There's another point, and I'm just going to put this particular slide up. Let me just push this button. Yeah. Don't know whether you saw this book, but I recommend it. It came out last year, February 2024, by Elizabeth Brow. It's called Goodbye Globalization, and it's called The Return of a Divided World. And essentially, this goes through why it is that the world is fragmenting. And it's actually a very, very powerful read. And, she makes a point about the supply chains were imperiled. We've got the Ukraine situation. We've got, a bunch of issues. And so it does beg the question, well, okay, what after globalization? Because globalization is falling apart, has fallen apart. Are we going to get regionalization? Are we going to get chaos? Who knows? And there's another term I want to bring in here, which I think is quite fun. and it's this one here. Let me just move that on. Have you heard of this? Glocalization. Glocalization, right? Now, glocalization is a really interesting concept. What it says is we're going to do a lot of stuff more locally, but it's not going to be a standard template globally. It's going to be different in different locations because countries have different needs and different capabilities. But the idea is that actually maybe we're going to effectively, fragment. But then I come back to my other point, because if you want my conspiracy theory is more to do with the large multinational corporations who are actually calling a lot of the shots and who have huge power and influence directly and indirectly, and who, by the way, pony up to the likes of Davos and the World Economic Forum. And so all of that stuff, is a set of very strong foundational principles that those people, the really affluent group, believe is right for the world. Now, I have a view that it's not actually necessarily good for the bulk of the world. And I'm of the view that if you look at the distribution of wealth and distribution of poverty, there are vast areas of the world that are actually really under the gun at the moment, literally and metaphorically. So the bottom line is that whilst I don't believe there's a cabal, I do believe that certain philosophies have driven us to this point. And I'm arguing that it's time for those philosophies to change. And the first change is, in my mind, empowering local communities and local people to do more rather than just relying top down on government. And the second is to recognize that the neoliberalism that has actually done nothing good for ordinary people needs to actually be really swept off the table. But of course, that's in direct opposition to where those large corporations would want to go, who still believe that the market should be the markets and, bigger is better. Well, I wonder whether that's true, especially when you think about the environmental consequences of what's happened as well.
Gold recently hit an all-time high. Actually, it continues to hit an all-time high nominally.
Yep.
Neil Dennison, I reckon he's a philosopher and a historian in my channel. He said something quite powerful. He said, has gold actually hit an all-time high, or did the US dollar hit an all-time low? Your thoughts?
Well, it comes back to this wonderful concept of what is the value anchor, right? Where do you pin your value to, right? Because up until quite recently, many people said, "Oh, the US dollar is the value anchor. That's the thing that you should compare everything with." I'm not sure it's that simple, because actually, depending on where you pin the value anchor to, you can make almost anything look cheap versus expensive. Now, true, gold has gone up, and it's gone up. I said for a long time, I believe that gold had been pretty much range bound simply because of the speculative element. But in the last 18 months or so, more and more central banks and more other agencies, like in China, for example, have been buying gold. And because of this, I believe that there's a bit of an evolution of the story, and gold will continue to rise for some time. At some point, it probably will come off a little, but not in the short term. The value of the dollar is a definite question. And the fact that it's significantly down is quite relevant. And, another way of telling the same story is, I always argue that house prices haven't gone up. The value of the dollar has gone down. So it's about, where is the value anchor?
Absolutely, I agree. So you and I agree entirely on this, that it's not so much that houses are going up. It's just that what it's compared to is going down. And equally with gold, it's not that gold is necessarily going up. It's just that what it's compared to is going down. But looking at things, I see the glass half full. What I see here is that the whole world is now having to talk about something that we never knew before. What didn't we know before? What we didn't know before is what money was. Where does money come from? We didn't understand what a global reserve currency was. We didn't understand what tariffs were. And now everyone's talking about this. And as we talk about this, it actually makes us realize how ignorant we were as a society, that we knew what, 300 genders were, but we didn't know what money was. And consequently, people are now having discussions that affect the economic future of all nations. Then it also, as you mentioned, what was that term you said? Not globalism, localism.
Yes.
I like that. bring. I'd never heard that before, but I'm going to dig into that a little bit deeper. It leads into the big questions here, Martin. Is this a good thing or is it a bad thing? Is what Trump is doing, at the beginning, it all feels bad. It all feels bad. Markets are down. The US, the stock exchange is down. The NASDAQ's down. Crypto markets are down. Everything's down except for gold. Gold seems to be the only thing up. Some would argue that the US dollar is up, the DXY is up, but the purchasing power of the US dollar is not up. So compared to other currencies, it's not so much that the dollar is getting stronger. It's just that everything around it is getting weaker. But equally, the dollar is getting weaker because they keep printing this worthless crap. But overall, is this a good thing?
Well, I think it depends who you are. Remember that there are people in the US who are sitting on huge fortunes at the moment and who will be looking for Trump to enable them to make even more fortunes, right? So there is a concentration of wealth like never before. It's true in the US, it's true in Australia, it's true in most other Western countries too. So if you are at that top end, in the short-term wobbles, you'll do very well and be significantly better off later. But if you are the ordinary worker, the worker bee, who basically has very little in the bank, who goes to work to pay the bills, to pay the mortgage, to be able to find somewhere to live, to effectively keep surviving. It's the rat race. It's just churning churning around just to keep going. There's nothing in this that is going to fundamentally change that in my mind. So I think it depends who you are and where you are as to whether it's a good thing or whether it's a bad thing. What I do think is good is that finally people are waking up to the stupidity that we've had through neoliberalism and the stupidity that we've had that somehow just outsourcing it to somewhere cheap overseas is the right answer. And, the bottom line is it's not always the right answer, but we need policies locally that will actually change a few things if we're going to actually really take anywhere different. And that takes us right back to the election question, right? So are we seeing anything in the election at the moment in Australia that would actually suggest they've got any idea about what needs to change? And I'm afraid that my view is they are still on the same old neoliberal bandwagon, despite the fact that I think neoliberalism is getting bust quite quickly because of what's going on currently. And what that basically means is that the current political debate in Australia is ideologically pretty useless.
And that's a beautiful segue into what's happening in Australia. So I really wanted to actually talk mainly about what's happening in the Australian election, but I thought it was fitting that we had to speak about what's happening with the tariffs because, of course, as I mentioned at the beginning of this stream, you've got these two happy chappies who seem to be leading the charge. And what I mean by that is many people believe that we're in a two-party system in Australia, but the reality is that it doesn't have to be Labor or Liberal. It could be someone else, but it seems so entrenched that it's either Labor or Liberal. So as I transition into this, you just mentioned, do they know what they need to do, or is it that they have no choice? And the example I give is when, I think it was around 2007, when Kevin Rudd, the Prime Minister of Australia at the time, tried to put a super tax onto the companies that were pulling huge amounts of resources out of our ground. Now, the super tax wasn't a super tax in itself. It was a higher tax on those multi-billion-dollar companies that were pulling resources out of our ground. And then he was sacked overnight. And we've spoken about it in previous streams together, that it's very difficult to lead this country, no matter which side of politics you're on, because at any time the party can fire you, even when you've been elected by the people, even though the party's elected. But equally, if you don't appease the people, then you're going to be sacked, if you will, or not voted in the next election. So you've got this dual puppet system where, if you will, the people are at the bottom end of the puppet system, and then the party's at the top of their puppet strings. But then I argue, on top of that, you've got the lobbyists who are paying the party to keep them in power, which leads me all the way back to who's in charge. But we've covered that tonight. What I'm wondering is, why won't Australia, wrongly or rightly, why won't they budge from Labor or Liberal? Why can't we adopt a completely different party? Why does it have to be these two?
Well, there's a couple of points there. The first is, of course, we have a must vote, you have to vote, compulsory voting system in Australia, which means that a lot of people, when they go to the polls, they don't really know what they're voting for. Now, I've always had the view that the problem with voting is that it's quite a responsible thing to be doing, yet a lot of people don't actually really have any idea of what they're voting for. So that's the first point. So there's a lot of naivety in the voting system. But let me take the UK as an example, right? We had an election last year. The first past the post system favors the two big parties in the UK. And in fact, Labour got back with 1/3 of the votes, but still managed to get a massive majority, biggest majority for a long, long time. So in fact, whilst they've got a massive majority and look as though they're powerfully set up, they only actually represent in the UK 1/3 of the votes. Now in Australia, because of the fact we've got the distribution process, what you end up with is, of course, is people put votes into the minor parties because they want to make a protest vote. Those minor parties don't have sufficient power to be able to get in, so they end up then effectively repurposing those votes forward, and you end up with a two-party preferred, and you've shown it there. It's pretty close. And, it's slightly above, slightly below 50-50. Now, that is the system that was, brought in. The system is designed to ensure that only the major parties can get back. And in fact, recently they've changed the legislation to make it harder for small parties to fund themselves to be able to actually get represented and get elected. So the system itself is designed in favor of the two major parties. First point. Second point, if you look carefully at the policies of the two major parties, they are about 80 to 85% the same. Both parties have a lot of common ground. There's a few things they differ about, but most of it's the same. So I always say it's two cheeks of the same bum, right? It doesn't matter which party's in, you'll still get the same stuff because they are driven by neoliberalism, by these philosophers we've been talking about. That neoliberal philosophy is actually welded into Treasury. And Treasury is a hugely powerful entity, never mind who gets elected. And I've had conversations with politicians who, before they were elected, with good intent, were wanting to change things, but then hit immediately the buffers because Treasury said, no, we're not doing that because it doesn't fit within our model. So Treasury's model is big migration, right? The big Australia is Treasury's model, right? Why? Because you get more taxes. That means you get more revenue. That means you can do stuff. So that's the first point. The second is that neoliberalism, let the markets be the markets, so don't interfere too much. Although, of course, now we've got Dutton saying he's going to interfere in the power industry through the gas and the power industry through the nuclear, which is quite interesting. I'm quite fascinated by the conservative side of politics now starting to stick their finger in the pie much more than previously, right? And then the third point is because of the government mechanisms, the status quo rules, and to move the status quo is really difficult. It's really, really hard to actually get anything other than the status quo because by definition, most people support the status quo within the parliamentary system. And again, what you find is that whilst there are people like, the independents, Gerald Rennick, for example, is a great example of an independent thinker in the parliament at the moment. He may or may not get re-elected. I hope he does, but he probably won't. But there are a lot of people who just play the game. And of course, politicians have a wonderful time because once they're elected, they have all of these wonderful, superannuation and everything else. And so they become part of the establishment. And you mentioned lobbying. Just to be clear, large corporates spend billions and billions of dollars directly and indirectly influencing the direction of policy and influencing the direction of what decisions are taken and where they're taken and how they're taken. That lobbying is another very important issue, which basically means that the democracy that we think we've got is an illusion. It actually doesn't matter which party you get back in. You are not going to fundamentally shift. Now, that is a hard thing for me to say, but I fundamentally believe that, having seen it over the years. Now, there is a a model of democracy where you say, no, the people should actually be more directly involved in the decisions. And of course, you could argue with the internet and the capability, you could turn it on its head and say, no, I don't want to be top down told what to do from the World Economic Forum down into the parliamentary system, blah, 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 blah. Or I want individuals to have a more direct voice. There is a way of doing it. You could do that with the internet. You could do that if you wanted to. But no, you don't want to do that, because the politicians would lose the power that they've got because they like it the way it is. And that's the point. Most of the people in the system currently, aligned to those large corporates, like the system the way it is. They've got their multiple investment properties. They've got their protected superannuation. So they're doing very well, thank you. And that is the problem. That's this disconnect that I see between ordinary people and what they are trying to do and the way the establishment works. And that's my point about, it's not somebody directly pulling the controls. It is a cock-up theory of history, but it's evolved the way it has, as I've described, and it makes it very hard to change.
It's a beautiful segue into a question here from Hippie Brofton. He says, do you think free speech may be part of the reason for the tariffs? Now, that question could be interpreted a few different ways, but you've just touched on the power of social media, and you and I have just worked together on the bloody Mad Bill, where they're trying to silence us, where they said, right, you have free speech, but only these 4 groups can speak without consequence: the government, the banks, the media, and the universities. Everyone else, you say the wrong thing, it's going to be a mistruth, because we get to decide what truth is, not you. We get to say what truth is, and if you speak, there's going to be consequences. And to me, that was a blatant example of governments moving in to shut us up. And once you silence us, and when people say, why do you need free speech? It's because if you can't talk, you can't question corruption. And if you can't question corruption, the corrupt will become even more corrupt. So at a baseline, you must be able to speak. And Jordan Peterson will take it a step further and says, if you can't speak, you can't think. And this really just locks us all down. So there's a theory out there that I spoke about it on my show the other night. I was saying that actually just last night, Trump, maybe what he's doing is he's very selfish and he's just doing it for himself and he's just doing it for America. Okay. And maybe he wants to ensure that there's democracy around the world. So he can't have a situation where the deep state tries to say he colluded with Russia, tried to put a bullet in his head, tried to impeach him, tried to put him in jail. Maybe he's safer for himself when he ensures that everyone else has free speech. And you can see that he actually stood up to the UK and even said to England that he was concerned about many of your fellow brothers and sisters being put in prison for putting up a post, putting up an image, or putting up a meme, or having a political opinion, or just a social commentary opinion that could result in police kicking down their door and putting them in jail. Meanwhile, other people could commit violent crimes and not experience as harsh a penalty for someone speaking words or posting something. I bring this now back to the tariffs. So we can see that there are many political levers or pressures that you can put onto your political opponents internally, but equally you can do it externally, where you can say, I don't like your behavior, therefore I'm putting a tariff on you. And there's lots of steps in between with diplomacy and tariffs and social pressure. And then, of course, the last one is war. Do you think that what Trump's doing here, it's a good question from Hippie, do you think these tariffs are a way of manipulating these countries to act in a certain way beyond financial parameters?
Well, I think there's certainly an argument for that. Tariffs can be used to influence and force negotiation. And a lot of people were believing that Trump was going to use tariffs for that purpose, right? But I argued, I think earlier on, I do think there was a set of economic principles that Trump is actually going with, which suggests this is more than just using them as a power lever. But I mean, Trump will do whatever he wants to do in terms of the different levers he's got, and this is a pretty powerful one. What I would say with regard to free speech, and I want to underscore again, free speech is something that people worked hard for many, many, many years to be able to have it to a greater or lesser extent. And in recent times, it's been taken away bit by bit, piecemeal by piecemeal, to make it harder for people to express alternative views, different views. Now, I've always of a great belief that, I should respect anybody's ability to be able to have a view, and make it, and then we'll have an argument about it. I'm a philosopher. I love debating things, and I learn things when I debate things, and I'm not always right, and that's fine. But what we don't want is where the Ministry of Truth comes out and says only these things are the truth, and everything else you can't even think about it, right? And I do come back to 1984 because that was a very prescient book, where in fact just having thoughts about it are actually bad and illegal. And that's close to where we are now with some of these recent developments. So free speech is pretty critical. And unfortunately, through social media, because the government doesn't like some of the things that are being raised, and they get very paranoid about some of the things that are actually being spoken about, because they're often being found out. Surprise, surprise. It seems to me that the easy answer is to dial back capacity for free speech. I mean, I have to be really careful on this on my channel, because if there are things that are said, and I had a show a couple of weeks ago with a guest who wanted to be the Senate candidate for New South Wales, Anishamo, and he's a associate professor, and he was questioning the independence of the regulators, and suggested that we've got big issues with the supermarkets, we've got big issues with ASIC, we've got big issues with the bank, and he's wanting to break them up, etc., etc. Now that show was effectively rated by YouTube as one that wouldn't be monetized. So even superficially, right, free speech can actually lead you into a problem where suddenly YouTube says, "Oh no, you can't say that and get away with it and monetize the show." So my point is, in the world of social media, there is a capacity for free speech, but also there are limitations on what can be done. And now the government is trying to turn up the volume on what can be said and what can't be said. And of course, they didn't get away necessarily with the original bill, but then they said, well, then if you're under 16, then you can't have access to social media. So crazy. But free speech is a hard-earned asset that we must not allow to be removed. And yet there are a lot of people who actually are calling for it. So that's why I'm resisting that particular call.
I watched that interview with Andy, and boy, was that colorful, and boy, was he passionate. Like, so in the background, many people were approaching me and they said, "Adam, you got to watch this video. Watch this." And I was getting bombarded with you got to, and then it went to the next step where it's like, you've got to have him on the channel. But I thought, well, am I going to get in trouble if I simply speak to someone? And so now I'm worried, can I actually speak to someone? Now, of course, where you are, you're in a much more dangerous position than me, because you're in a country where people do kick down your door for having a conversation on the internet. And if you're only worried about a video being demonetized, well, that's one thing. But, I really think in your position, I was impressed that you had the courage to put that video up. I believe in free speech, but where you are, there seems to be less of a, I guess, parallel thought of supporting that free speech. Now, I have thought about bringing him on the channel. I think the swearing may be a bit of an issue, but he is what he is, and it was a very interesting interview, and you could see the comments were melting. People were getting passionate, and it's good to mention him now, because you've mentioned about the political leadership here. We've spoken about it. It's two cheeks to the same bum, two wings to the same bird, and there just seems to be no difference. It literally seems to be no different. If I go left or right, Labor or Liberal, there's really no difference. And you actually quantified some of that with, I think you said 85% of their policies are pretty much the same. There doesn't seem to be any difference with their policies, maybe with nuclear energy versus solar energy.
There's a few. Yeah.
But not. There's not 80% difference. There's like 15% difference, and to me that doesn't seem like much. And then even when the parties get in my mind, nothing seems to be changing. The only thing that seems to be changing in my life is that the more money I earn, the poorer I am. The more I pay in taxes, the less purchasing power I have. And it's no secret I'm pretty well off, but it's just it seems to be getting harder. It's like, what I thought, as I get older and richer and more cash flow and more properties, I thought I'd be experiencing life in easy mode.
Let me just show you this slide. Put this one up.
Mm-hmm.
Right. If you're feeling uncomfortable about income tax, this is what the PBO, the parliamentary budget people are saying. So they're going to say the personal income tax receipts will continue to rise to an even higher level over the next years out to 2032, 33. Right. So the truth is that we actually have a greater share of tax being taken than ever in recent times. And if you go back in the 1980s, it was pretty much the same level, right? Why? Because profligate spending from government, firstly. Secondly, the corporate tax is not growing. There's a lot of corporations who have a free ride and actually get massive government handouts and don't pay any tax or almost minimal tax, right? And yet the government is putting more and more weight on ordinary people. And whilst there's a little talk of a small tax rise from the Labour side, the bracket creep that's already in the system means that you're going to be the worse off next year and the year after and the year after, right? Because bracket creep is still there. And the bracket creep means that as your income rises, you end up paying incrementally more in tax. So again, this is an example of the structural problem that we have. Neither side of politics wants to tackle this critical issue. We are paying way too much in income tax. Why? Because there's a lot of spending that shouldn't be happening, firstly. And secondly, the truth is that we're not getting sufficient income from the corporate end of the world. Why? Because those corporates are big at lobbying and are very capable of jumping up and down and also getting huge handouts. Government handouts, it's very hard to get all the information, but there's a huge amount of money going to corporates. And I will just want to make one other point, because I think there's a really interesting little story here, which people may not be aware of. And I want to talk about this because there is a policy that the Labour Party have of taxing unrealized gains. I made a show on this the other day called The Next Income Tax Grab, Taxing Unrealized Gains. And people may not be aware of this. If they are, make a fuss, because this is horrendous. So what they're saying here is that if you have superannuation balances above $3 million, now we're not going to tax you on when you trade, when you sell or buy. What we're going to do is value your portfolio every year, and if you've made gains, we'll tax you on those unrealized gains. Now that's $3 million. So everyone says, oh, that's not an issue. That's only very rich people. So not really impacting us. But that $3 million is not inflation adjusted. So over time, more and more people will end up with superannuation balances that will actually be in there. First point. Second point, if they do it for superannuation balances, this idea of taxing unrealized gains will be rolled out further, have no doubt about it. So your personal savings and maybe even the value of your property. So there is a really important philosophical point here about we should not be taxing unrealized gains. Now, in some countries, it's done quite broadly, like in Germany, in others not. But in this grasp for more tax, this is actually policy of this current Labour government. But I've not seen, well, there was one article, I think, on News Corp, but this has not been debated. This has not been spoken about. And for me, this is another example of more tax take. Disgraceful.
It's terrifying. So let's just unpack tax on unrealized gains. So this article here from news.com.au, budget reveals Labor pushing ahead with tax on unrealized capital gains for superannuation. I just read the first couple of paragraphs. It was one of Kamala Harris's first controversial policies that even one of her most ardent supporters called an economy killer. But Tuesday's budget reveals Labor is full steam ahead on taxing unrealized capital gains. The proposal, first announced in the 23-24 budget, would impose an additional 15% tax on unrealized gains on superannuation balances over $3 million. This is terrifying. This should be spoken about quite loudly. Now, for our international viewers, superannuation is our pension funds or our 401k funds. There is a massive honeypot in the Australian economy of, I don't know, billions, potentially trillions of
4.2
trillion. There you go. A trillion, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's $4.2 trillion sitting in.
And by the way, that 4.2 trillion was what they took over to Trump and offered to invest in the US to try and avoid the tariffs. Do you remember that?
What? Oh, that's right.
This is important. They actually took a whole bunch of superannuation funds, and said that the leaders of the superannuation funds and went to the US to argue that we've got this massive pool of funds that we're happy to invest in the US. Just don't give us any tariffs, right? So they did that quite recently.
With our money.
Yeah. Well, in fact, more superannuation is being invested overseas because the Australian markets haven't performed very well, right? So it'll be very interesting to see to what extent that downturn in the US markets folds back into reduced performance of the superannuation funds in Australia. It's quite likely it will.
Ultimately, like balances over $3 million, as you said, to the untrained eye, that sounds like a lot of money, $3 million. $3 million is nothing in today's economy, particularly when, let's say you retire at 65 and you've got to live for another 20 or 30 years and you've got $3 million in your superannuation and they're going to take 15% before you even get to touch it. And then you tax throughout then, and then you've got GST and inflation itself going up. So that $3 million turns into nothing very quickly. And then, of course, when you die,
actually, it's even worse than that because it's 1.9 million. If you move into the drawdown stage of superannuation, you can do it up to 1.9 million, but not above. So you've actually got this weird gap, and again, it goes back to the philosophical foundation of the way that superannuation was designed to work isn't working at all well. And they're now looking at all of this magic money that's there and thinking, oh, we got to do something with it. We got to invest it in, I don't know, housing or whatever, right? It is, and no, Nathan, it's not just a liberal hit piece.
Nathan B has just said, surely this is just a liberal hit piece.
No, it's not. It's in the budget. Read the budget papers. It's there.
It's documented by the government in power at the moment. So what you're saying is, if the Labor government is successful in its election campaign and gets another term, they will be implementing a tax on unrealized gains. Or does it still have to pass?
They actually tried to get it in Parliament last time, but it was blocked by some of the independents. So it didn't actually get up, but it hasn't been taken away. It's still there. It's still in the numbers. So they were still assuming they're going to get it through.
Steve J says something quite powerful. He says, when you're stuck in a 30-year mortgage, which I might add, they're now looking at 40 and 50-year mortgages. Yep. And have you even heard about the 100-year mortgages where you pass it down?
Intergenerational mortgages. Yeah, you just leave your mortgage for your for your family. That's fine. Happy Christmas.
Here's your debt. So Steve J says, when you're stuck in a 30-year mortgage and you have handed over your capital to become the bank's bitch, you also lose your voice to protest. Now,
very true.
Yeah, it is very true. And thank you, Steve, our philosopher out there. You and Steve would have great conversations. What was interesting to me during the lockdown was that in the pandemic, it also showed how your body could be controlled. That is, if you don't inject this fluid into your body, that may or may not kill you, or may not save you, or may not give you a stroke. The data is now coming out. You can't go to work. And if you can't go to work, then you can't get money. If you can't get money, then you lose your house and you can't eat. So one of the things for me, and when we first met, Martin, I remember you and I have the same vision of no debt. And on this channel, it is no secret that if you make your fortunes in any industry, number one, pay your bloody taxes because you can't get away from that. But number two, get rid of your debt. No debt, no mortgage, no credit card debt, no nothing. And you mentioned that, you own your own home and you got the title because you didn't want the debt. And I thought that was fantastic. But we can see that if you've got debt, as Steve J is saying here, that really you lose your voice. And you lose your voice because if you don't play the game, particularly if you're working for the government, you get sacked and then you lose your house. So you have to submit to what the narrative is. And it gets quite concerning for me because you can see there's really only two parties, even though it doesn't have to be that way. It seems that that's how we operate in Australia. It's a two-party system. There's not too much difference between their policies. neoliberalism seems to be the way to go. And then you can see that there's now tax upon more tax. Meanwhile, they're printing money, and now they want to tax your profits before you even liquidate those profits, before unrealized capital gains. And in my world, in crypto, what we can see, there's a huge push now for, and it's been around for a while. I remember, I think it was Kim Beazley years ago when I was a little boy. I think he was talking about the brain drain, where we educate these good Australians and they get a good education, but we don't give a good opportunity to them, so they leave. They take their brains with them, and the country was draining their brains. And now when we move into this next wave of wealth, I can see a lot of people now. There's a channel called the Nomad Capitalist, Andrew Henderson, a gentleman I've had on this channel, and his industry is booming. His punchline is essentially go to where you're treated best. And what he's saying is that it doesn't matter where you're from. He's mainly focusing on Western nations, though. He's saying go to where your money is treated best. Now, what we're facing in crypto, some people are making money, some people are losing money. But even out of crypto, people who have got a job, they're paying a huge amount of tax. So now there's huge moves for people to leave Australia. So on one hand, we have the doors wide open to get this immigration in, like heaps of immigration that's decimating the housing industry. I would argue decimating the labor market, in the sense when you've got an oversupply of labor but an undersupply of jobs, price equilibrium will drop. Therefore, your hourly wage is not as competitive as what it would be in a competitive employment market. That is, not as many employees as there are employers. That would naturally push the price of wages up, irrespective of government intervention. So now I can see, on one hand, you've got immigration flooding the markets with newer money coming in, but then Australians are now pulling the pin and throwing smoke. You, my friend, are an example. You have left this country. On this channel, I won't mention them by their name, but many people on this channel, they have left the country because they can't afford to live here anymore. And even if they can afford to live here, it's like, yeah, I can buy food and I can pay the rent, or I can pay my mortgage. It's like, I've had enough. I don't want to pay so much anymore. I want to go to where my money is being treated better, where I'm being treated better. From what you're seeing here, from you as one of these statistics, are you better off? Are you happier? Was it the right move for you to leave Australia and go to where you were treated better?
Well, from an economic perspective, absolutely. So just to give you one case study example, in Australia, to have a decent interconnection that I needed for my work, it was costing me $1,300 a month. Right, the same service in the UK is £60, $120 a month. Just one example, right? Or another example, typical food. I was shopping in Australia, about $170 to $180 a week. In the UK, about £50 or $100. So basic costs of living are definitely more expensive in Australia, which is quite interesting, because when I arrived in Australia in the mid-90s, that was not true. I actually was amazed how cheap everything was. I remember seeing, potatoes that were amazingly cheap and thinking, wow, this is good. So when I first came to Australia in the mid-90s, it was a great place. It was a very open place. There was a lot of freedom. Economically, you could get around. Houses were relatively cheap relative to income, and it felt like a great place to be for all those reasons. But I think it's deteriorated considerably over the many, many years. And, I've had many conversations with people who are really in Australia, but worrying about whether, in fact, Australia is now the place that it was and whether they should stay. And it comes right back to this election, right? So what policies in the upcoming election are going to tackle some of the underlying structural issues that we've got, which is we're paying too much in the way of income tax. Our income in real terms isn't growing. We've got this corporate overhead, and we've got this question of housing. Again, not enough discussion about the real issues, the tent cities. People have just accepted tent cities in Brisbane and places like that. It's amazing. 20 years ago, they wouldn't have. So what is it? And it goes back to, I think, that earlier comment. If you're in the system and, you're paying your mortgage, you've got very little wriggle room. And it's a bit like the old Matrix, with the blue pill and the red pill, right? If do you really want to understand what's going on? Do you really want to really stand back and look at it? Or do you just want to say, no, I'm going to put my fingers over my ears and I'll just keep on going and carry on? It's like I said earlier on, the problem I have is that the wage slave, the debt slave, whatever you want to call it, a lot of Australians in my surveys are in that position where they've got no choice but just to carry on and hope that we magically get a way through this. But the politicians have nothing. They've got nothing in their kit bag that gives me any confidence at all that they know what they're doing and they've got our best interests at heart. Now, the downside in the UK is they're the same here too. So it's not politically better, but economically, yeah, it's definitely economically better here than there at the moment.
We've just got to address a false accusation. Sean Smith, you have said, oh, the irony, watching you guys talking about free speech and getting my comments blocked at the same time. Sean, your allegation is completely vexatious. You put in the same comment 7 times. If you want your comment to come to the top, give a super chat, but do not flood the comments repeatedly with the same comment over and over again. You've been in the community for a long time. I expect better from you. Neil Dennison says, would the integrational mortgages come with inheritance tax?
No, don't think so. I don't think they've got. I mean, in Japan, you can get 90-year mortgages, and you basically pass them down from generation to generation because people often live in the same properties, right? So it's sort of attached to the property rather than the individual. So that's the way it works there. But the problem I've got is that these long-term mortgages, people don't realize how much more interest they're paying. I mean, you might have a slight reduction in the monthly repayment, but you're paying the banks loads. They love you. They love you because they just want those income flows. You are an income flow, right? Remember, that's how the banks look at you. They think you are just a cash flow. That's all they think about. They don't think about the individual. You are a cash flow.
I've had stories from the viewers out there where they've said they're just about to pay off their mortgage and the banks ring them up and like, no, don't pay it off. You can have a line of credit. You can draw equity out of your, but no, I want to pay it off. And it seems so difficult to actually pay off your own property just so you can own it, even though you've met your obligation with the banks.
Well, the banks only have one idea. They only understand lend, right? And that's one of the reasons why property prices have shot through the roof. It's because your credit capacity has been increased. That means you can borrow more. That means you can push prices up, which means that the banks can lend more, which means their balance sheet goes up, which means that prices go up. You can borrow more. It is that perpetual stupid Ponzi cycle that's created the housing problem we've got. Unless they tackle migration, and unless they tackle this issue of the bank Ponzi, prices will go on, continue to go higher. And I keep asking the question, when is too much? CoreLogic's latest figures, well, they've gone up again, right? When is it not going to go up? We are 40 to 50% above where we should be relative to income. And yet people are still happy to pay. Why? Because they've got no choice. If you want somewhere to live, you got to play the game. That's just the way that the system works, because what's the choice? Paying in the rental sector, you pay through the nose and then you get a 10% increase each year. I mean, it's crazy. Policies of failure. This is massive policy failure over 30 years. Neither side of government has anything to say that is worth listening to on housing, and that's another problem in this current election. Whilst there's you can use a superannuation, or we'll do a few things here, or the government story about the housing fund where they've actually bought properties to turn them into socially responsible housing, but that's not increasing the supply of housing. All that is doing is just buying property that's already there. So a housing finance corporation has not built one additional house. So crazy.
Taxes are very interesting. I mean, people think of just an income tax or a goods and services tax, but I've done a video or a section on this channel where the list of taxes in Australia are phenomenal. Hemi Raw has raised a good point here. He said early 90s, you could buy a packet of PJ30s, which is a packet of smokes, cigarettes, and a carton of VB Stubbies for $20. I just want to actually touch on something, ironically, with cigarettes. So I was in a situation the other day where I had to buy a packet of cigarettes. So a mate who's a smoker, which they're very rare these days, he did some work for me, and I said, I'll get you a packet of smokes. Now, I didn't know. I went to buy these cigarettes, and she goes, that's $72. And I said, no, not a carton, just a packet. And she looked at me and she goes, no, that's how much a packet of cigarettes is. And I'm like, $72. And at the same time, what's happening in the news is that you've got this thing called Chop Chop. Chop Chop is tobacco, but it's a black market for tobacco. And now you have a lot of violence in Australia around the tobacco industry. So you've created these gang wars in Australia where there's a drug called tobacco that is legal, but then they keep cranking up the tax on it to when it becomes $72, where typically there's a correlation between those who are low socioeconomic and smoke. So they can't afford a day's food or 2 days' food to buy their cancer sticks. So what they do is they go onto the black market. Now, by default, the government has created this black market of cigarettes that are mainstream that cost $72 or whatever a packet. And then you can go behind the scenes and buy this Chop Chop.
Adam, my delivery's just arrived, so I'm just going to disappear for a second. You keep
No worries,
talking.
we're
I'll be back in a
expecting
second,
that.
all right? Yep.
I'll just get rid of mutton there. So what's interesting, Hemi Raw, is what you've raised here is quite interesting, is because I also didn't realize that the Australian government has put so much tax on alcohol. Now, let's look at two sides here. One side is you're trying to dissuade alcohol purchases and you're trying to dissuade tobacco purchases. And that sounds good, but it's still available. And as a result, people are paying a fortune for the legal product, or they're pushed into the illegal market. And that illegal market is now resulting in a lot of violence where shop fronts are being burnt down, which ironically, all the taxes that have been raised from putting cigarettes through the roof is now being put into rebuilding infrastructure that's being burnt to the ground, or equally it's being put into police investigations who have to look at this infrastructure being burnt to the ground and violent crimes and things getting out of control. So it's very concerning to me that some of these taxes or some of these intents, you aim for A and you achieve B. Going to your comments, viewers, you say, believe in yourself until interest rates fall, then they turn off lending, ? Ramsey says, I guess it's good if you use the line of credit to buy appreciating assets and investments. Potentially. Jenny D says, you don't own your own property because the government have made titles digital where they are the leaseholder of your property. Jenny D, you raise a good point here. So in the Australian Capital Territory and other territories, you're never actually buying your property, you are leasing your property. And one of the viewers out there recently, as Martin comes in, Martin, Jenny D, you got my audio?
Yeah.
But Jenny D's just said you don't actually own your property in Australia because the government have made all titles digital where they are the leaseholder of your property. So in the ACT, the Australian Capital Territory, you get a 99-year lease. In New South Wales, it's slightly different. But one of my subs actually told me recently that they paid off their house and they were trying to get the title to their house and the government wouldn't give it to them. The bank wouldn't give it to them and the government wouldn't get them to them. And now Jenny D's coming in and saying, well, now because it's all digital. What are your thoughts on that?
So basically the physical deeds no longer exist. It's all been digitalized, right? And it's also outsourced in a number of states as well. So it's not even owned and managed by the state anymore. So this is an interesting question. What is the thing that confirms your title to the property? It's actually a digital record, right? So it'll be great until we get an EMP and then suddenly all the records are gone. And then what do you do?
Well, of course, this is where I lean in with my crypto, my good man. You make that you make that title an NFT. It makes perfect sense to me. It's just how do you store it digitally? Do you want to store it digitally on a centralized database, or do you want to decentralize it?
Yeah. So the point is the digital title has the same rights as the physical title, but you won't get the physical deeds.
A viewer before asked, where are all these Australians and Westerners going when they leave the West? And A&A Wales given a question or a point here. He says, I was in Thailand a few months ago and got 2 energy drinks, 2 waters, 2 Cokes, couple of bags of chips, chocolate, a packet of cigarettes, and a lighter for about 14 Australian dollars. So to the viewer before who said, well, where are all these people going? They're going anywhere but here. They're going anywhere but the West. They're going to where they're treated best. Now, the reality is when you move to these certain nations, there are some things that you are giving up, but there are many things that you are gaining. And it's that balance where you've got to figure out, well, UAE is an example where a lot of people are going to Dubai. Rent is very expensive in Dubai. And some aspects are a little bit more expensive in Dubai, but because you're not paying tax, particularly if you're on, if you're paying 6-7 figures a year, 8 figures a year, for some people are on tax, you don't care about the high rent because that's a microscopic proportion of what tax you were paying back in your own country. So we were talking about this before. Are all these taxes that they're putting on the country, are we cutting off our own nose to spite our own face?
Well, there's a thing called the Laffer curve. I don't know whether you've come across the Laffer curve, but it was the sort of the idea was, it was actually Reagan, I think, who sort of used it when he was in the US. There's a distribution curve, right? If you put the tax rates up too much, what you end up doing is losing tax income rather than not gaining it, or losing it rather than gaining it. Yeah, there you go. Because what it means is that people will find ways round, or they'll actually leave the country, etc., etc. On the other hand, if you actually put the tax rate too low, then you start losing capacity for tax, and therefore you don't get as much. So the interesting question is, where are we on that Laffer curve? And people have rubbished the Laffer curve, but philosophically, it makes sense. There's a point where you can try and get more tax out of the system, but people will actually leave, or they will find ways around it, or they'll go tax avoidance or whatever, right? I think in Australia now we're right above the peak of the Laffer curve. So they turn the amp up more and try and get a little bit more in the way of tax. But the problem is that we're now at the point where it's hard to do. And what it means is that those who actually have more capacity, maybe you get expert tax advice, et cetera, that means that you have the capacity to, find ways around the tax system. But it's the ordinary people, it's the ordinary Australians who are getting forced to pay more and more of their tax. And the fact is now that if you look carefully at the distribution of tax, those on lower incomes are paying considerably more than they ever did at a time when the costs of living are very high, when the costs of finding somewhere to reside in, be it a mortgage or whether rent, is very high. So that is one of the reasons why people have less money to spend, because they're paying more. And in fact, the impost from the tax is a lot higher than the impost from the rate, from the rent increase, or from the interest rate increase. And if you then add in things like rates and those other things has also gone up as well, it's horrendous. That's why the cost of living is a big story. Now, I really have not seen anything in the government policies for this election to really tackle any of the root cause issues around cost of living. They're giving a bit more money, another $100 and something for electricity. Wow, that's really good, right? But there's no real intent to deal with this problem. So I come back to the fact this election is being fought on their turf rather than the turf it should be being fought on. Why? Because they've got no answers to the questions that we should be asking.
Does the media play a part in that? Is it their fault that they're not asking the right questions?
Absolutely. I mean, did you see that the other day there were a couple of people throwing questions that the media should have been asking, right? And the politicians just ignored the questions.
Yeah.
They don't want to answer these hard questions because they are responsible, due to their bad policy and due to that over-influence of major corporates, all the stuff we've been talking about, right? They are responsible for the mess that Australia is in. It is a policy failure. It is not just happenstance. It isn't just COVID. It isn't just, Ukraine and oil prices. They made bad decisions. And the bigger one, the energy one, right? Our gas price is driven by the international price of gas. Why? Because we are shipping 80% of gas produced in Australia offshore to those big multinationals who make a huge amount of profit. None of that comes back in the way of tax. Our gas price in Australia is an international price. And because of that, electricity is very high, which means that energy is very high, which means we can't afford to actually get businesses to work, never mind paying it as individuals or households. So gas policy, energy policy, massive failure. Housing policy, massive failure. The fact that, as Andy said, the supermarkets are ripping us off, they're gouging us, major policy failure. We've only got one airline, really, Qantas and Jetstar, Virgin is there as a bit part player. We should not be satisfied with these structural stupidities that we've got in Australia. But the fact is, who fails at the end of the day? Politicians don't mind too much, but individuals and households, they're getting taken to the cleaners. And as for small businesses, my small business surveys show that thousands of small businesses have actually had to close because these costs are way off. This is policy failure on a massive scale, right? We should be holding our politicians to account, but unfortunately, the media don't do what they should be doing, which is actually be asking the hard question. They're just towing the line.
I just want to quickly touch on this Laffer curve. I'm glad you brought it up. When I did my economics degree, I remember learning this curve. I mean, it's the most simple curve you can look at in any macroeconomic policy or tax theory.
Yeah,
And
you know, he drew it on a serviette in a restaurant.
yeah, and it's funny because it's so powerful because it's so true. So you squeeze as much out of the juice out of the orange as you can, and then you can't get any more, and then you're just wasting your energy, and people flee the economy. I can't help to think. I've often thought of the Laffer curve when they just keep putting up more and more taxes. When people exit at this point here, where they exit at the top, so the mass exodus. I thought, is it that politicians don't understand this, or have they cracked the code? And they have cracked the code. In my opinion, what they've done is they're like, all right, well, when these people exit, we'll just import new ones.
Yes.
and that's what's happening here. So you squeeze as much juice as you can out of the Australian people, and then if they go right, they're out. So all right, we'll just import new ones. Just get new people in.
And look, the final point, just to bring this back round to the Trump thing, right? Albo now has a perfect alibi for the policy failure. He can blame Trump.
Absolutely. And Mick has just said that. Mick says, I bet they blame it on Trump when it hits the fan. I agree entirely. So it's very convenient. And, conspiracy theories, there was always something to blame. So we are a nation resource rich. We are land rich. We should be brain rich in the sense that we can produce educated and smart people. We should be able to produce a lot of industry we did in the past. And that's all been squeezed out now. And you can't help to think that every time something happens, every time something doesn't work out, it's always someone else's fault. So It was Russia's fault. It was Putin's fault. It was the pandemic's fault. And now, as you're dead right, now it's Trump's fault. And it's like, it's always someone else's fault. And it brings us full circle to maybe this is a good opportunity for many nations just to stand on their own feet and look after themselves. I'm cognizant of time. I just want to go through a few quick points here. Steve J says, don't forget the people Ponzi, Martin. So the people Ponzi scheme of bringing in more people, producing more people, as in producing reproduction, if you will. But if we're not reproducing enough, which we're not.
The birth rates continue to drop.
That's
Why?
right.
Because people are forming households later. They're having less kids because it's too expensive. So they've got to bring people in. Yeah.
So just import new people. Crypto Boy Nick says, Australia's digestion of land titles, a digitization rather, means homeowners will no longer own their properties. A social media user is claiming this is false. The move to digital does not alter the ownership rights. I concur with that. Nick's pretty switched on. A.N.A. Wow says, scapegoat Trump, tinfoil hat moment. He was allowed to win at the worst time, so that when it inevitably goes to shit, he's blamed for not being able to fix an unsolvable problem. I think it's a tinfoil hat moment, but it's something we've spoken about on the channel, that if an economy is like an aircraft carrier and it's moving at 30 knots towards the reef and it's just about to crash, and then the captain of the ship goes, all right, I'm out, it's over to you, Martin, you steer this ship, and then you try to steer the ship, but it's too big and it's got too much velocity and it crashes into the reef and everyone perishes. It's like, oh well, clearly it was the guy who was at the helm. It's like, no, it was too late. It was a guy that was at the helm before that, or maybe 2 or 3 times before the helm before that.
Yeah, but what you don't realize, on the back of the carrier, there was a rocket, and in the rocket were all the rich people, and they took off and landed perfectly safely.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said. Look, I want to close off with this. Australian elections coming up. We've got these 2 fine happy chappies coming here. Is there any hope? We touched on it before, but I just want to close off.
Yes.
Is there any hope that it won't be these 2? Is it possible? I mean, is it possible
So
that an independent could win?
Yeah. The point I want to make this point in closing. Use your vote carefully and strategically, right? There are minor parties who could make a huge difference. And my belief is that this election could be different, because the amount of dissatisfaction with the 2 major parties is higher than I've ever seen it. But the question is, will people actually vote strategically and vote for the minor parties? If they do, and if the minor parties actually get over a certain point, then the way the voting system works, it can really create a cascading difference. And that means you could end up with a very different parliament. You could end up with a minor party in power with the support of the minor parties themselves, or one of the major parties plus the minor parties. So I'm not sure how the math works, but the point is we've got to break the mold. The only way to break the mold is to vote for the minor parties.
Your eye on anyone who could be a front runner in the minor parties?
I think it depends where you are. I mean, Gerard Rennick, I think, is very interesting in where he's going on. The Citizens Party in some other parts of the country are running candidates too. Obviously, you've got One Nation, and there's a few different options. Depends where you are across the country. But the point there is, if you play the cards carefully, I think there is a really interesting opportunity this time around. I could be wrong. It may be that the two-party preferred system just swamps it all, and you end up with what you end up. But the point is, there is an opportunity, I think, this time around. So
Amanda Ali wants me to interview Tim Manger from Beat the Reset about the housing topic. We were just on, especially amongst all the other topics to do with the reset happening. I think a lot of people are talking, and it was very interesting when you had your professor on recently, not your professor, but the professor, Andy. He was very good. There's one thing that I took from him. It's not just, was it he that said it? I'm overloaded with information, but it's not just about talking or complaining about it. We need solutions.
absolutely.
The solutions, I think, exist, but it's do we have the appetite to pursue them? But if you're in a mortgage debt and you can't speak, it becomes quite risky. Martin, I've thoroughly enjoyed this. I'm very grateful for your time. I hate to say that I'm drained after this, not from talking to you, but from the depressing reality of the world that we live in. I'm depressed in this, well, not clinically depressed. I'm upset in the sense that there's no reason for this, in the sense that we could be so rich, we could be so free.
Yep.
There could be so much opportunity. Why we've had it before, and we had it with lesser technology, with lesser innovation and lesser opportunities, and now we've got so much innovation and technology and opportunities, and it's just getting harder and harder. So maybe it goes to a tipping point where things get so difficult that it has to tip, it has to turn. Maybe Trump is forcing us to stand on our own feet, or maybe it's all going to fall to pieces and kinetic war kicks off. Closing words to you, my friend.
So 2 points. First is, it's really important for people to try and understand what things really are, right? Going back to the Matrix and the red pill, blue pill, right? It's really important not just to take what the mainstream is saying as true, and don't be just misled by the superficial policies that are being trotted out left, right, and center. There are some really critical issues that could make a significant difference for the future. And, it's about the size of Australia. It's about the migration question. It's housing. It's, a bunch of stuff like that. First point. Second point, don't also be misled by the deflection, the misdirection. Oh, it's all Trump's problem, or the international, there are critical issues in Australia for Australians. What your vote is and where you vote this time around is probably more critical than I think it's ever been, because we need change. But the final point is there's hope. There are policies out there. There are things that could be done that could take us to a very different future, a future where ordinary people have a better share of the wealth of the country and more control over what's going on. There is hope. So don't leave this show feeling hopeless, but rather feel empowered to use your vote and hopeful that we can actually make things different, because it is possible.